Hi, my name's Phil. I like to come out politics. And Donald Trump has said he's going to begin raising tariffs on three of America's biggest trading partners on August the 1st, Mexico, Canada and the EU. The only reason the markets seem to be wearing it is because nobody really believes Trump is serious about tariffs anymore until they see the action in reality. But let's say Trump is serious. The EU at least are strong enough to bite back. So how should they approach this? But first, for daily news and politics, please click the subscribe button to stay notified. So at the moment, the EU is not ramping up threats of counter tariffs as they have in similar situations in the past. That being said, we know the Commission have been working on responses ever since Trump first went ahead with his high tariff strategy this spring. The problem for the EU, just like everyone else, is nobody really knows what Trump is going to do. Possibly not even Trump himself. If he unleashes his 35% tariffs against Canada and 30% against Mexico and the EU, then when taking account of the similar tariffs on China, even though they're way lower than they were, Trump will have imposed what are fairly hefty import taxes on goods coming from all four of America's top trading partners. The cost to the US economy would be pretty impressive. And once Wall Street gets used to the idea that Trump means it, well, they'll start dumping stocks again. In fact, it's been pointed out that investors are, it's understandable, but it's unfortunate that they're not exactly helping here. Because of the concept of taco, Trump always chickens out. Investors are not panicking when Trump announces unwise tariff moves. But because the only thing which got Trump to back down before was the markets melting, their failure to melt when he says something stupid now arguably could encourage him to go ahead with it. It may be that a fall in the markets is Trump's early warning system, that he sort of recognises he doesn't really know what he's doing. He knows he wants to raise tariffs as much as possible because he wants the income. He thinks he can replace income tax. And so he's sort of testing the waters. Well, I'll ramp up a little bit, see what the markets are fine with that. Okay, I can do that. You know, if the markets remain reasonably stable, he may think investors are happy with his plans rather than just not believing he's serious. So although there's no way the USA can actually impose these high tariffs on markets such as the EU without causing immense damage to their own economy, it doesn't necessarily mean Trump won't try. When he first announced them, I thought it was just political games. You know, we're coming up to the end of this sort of period of time where his tariffs have got to start coming into effect. And I was thinking he's just playing a game. He knows that there's a deal with all three markets, probably close to agreement. And he's making a big show of looking tough so that when he announces the deals, he can claim to his supporters that his big talk, his threats won concessions. And nobody from the other side would bother to contradict him because, well, why would you? Let Trump take the credit in order to stabilise trade again. This might also explain why the EU Commission have not ramped up threats of retaliation. But then Macron called for the EU to defend European interests in the face of the tariff threat, an implication that if this is just all smoke and mirrors to let Trump look tough to his supporters, Macron is not in on the ruse. That being said, if Trump does go ahead, there will be retaliation. The EU has already earmarked 21 billion euros worth of counter tariffs. They did that a while ago, which they've paused until August the 1st to coincide with Trump's own pause. The implication being that if Trump goes ahead with his threat, he will find tariffs on US exports the same day. And Trump has said that whatever the EU applies in the form of retaliatory tariffs, he will make sure US tariffs are the same plus 30%. In other words, he is threatening to kill off all trade between the US and EU, just as he did in realistic terms with China before backing down. So would the EU just do the same as China? Well, it would be less straightforward for Europe. China had multiple advantages which the EU does not have. It's a dictatorship, so they can respond as they like. Doesn't really matter what the public think. They don't publish accurate economic data, so the damage to China could be hidden from public sight. China had spent a decade getting ready for this trade war to limit that damage. And whereas the EU believed the US would always be a stalwart ally of theirs in both trade and defence, with trade friction limited to a small number of sensitive commodities like steel, China was expecting this to happen at some point and they were preparing for it. So if the EU escalated as China did, they could absolutely force Trump into backing down. if they can hold their nerve. But given that individual member states may blink early, in fact, there's signs that some already have, can they guarantee doing that? Another factor is Russia. See, with China, the trade war was purely about trade. With the EU, European leaders have worked for half a year to persuade Trump that it's more profitable, at least, to side with them on Ukraine's side than with Russia. Especially now that Europe is paying for American defence supplies to Ukraine. In fact, on that point, isn't it odd that the decision to cover the cost of US weapons to Ukraine, whilst letting Trump get the credit, is somehow not enough for him? Is that because Trump is just playing a game for his supporters, like I say? Or is it because the EU hasn't quite managed to walk that line that people who know Trump say you need to do, which is you've got to stand up to him. You've got to stop him thinking you're an easy touch. But at the same time, you also let him have to, he needs something valuable. Basically, if you look weak, Trump will keep coming back for more. But if you're too in his face, he risks going into revenge mode. But unlike the trade war Trump tried starting during his first term, albeit on a smaller scale, where the EU fired back, on this occasion, Europe is factoring in the risks and rewards of Trump adopting certain positions over Russia-Ukraine. Although his support is being paid for by Europe, it is still support. Trump could block the sale, even though it's like a commercial arrangement now, he could still block the sales and at any time. So given that Europe cannot supply Ukraine with everything it needs, even the commercial nature of Trump's support has value. The more Russia attacks Europe, any part of Europe, the more trade is damaged. Trade took a massive hit from the full-scale invasion in 2022. It's not recovered. So paying to contain Russia is worth it economically as well as morally. It may be that the 10% baseline tariffs is considered acceptable for the time being at least. 30% would kill off too much trade. That would be out of the question. The EU would look incredibly weak if it allowed Trump to impose 30% tariffs without a firm response. But it is still likely that Trump has no serious intention of imposing these tariffs. I mean, look at it this way. August the 1st. August is the month where trade generally starts to ramp up. Autumn and early winter contain a lot of big consumer events, particularly in America. You know, you've got Halloween, you've got Thanksgiving, you've got the Super Bowl, you've got Christmas. All huge consumer events, which if you applied large tariffs on your major imports, would mean inflation exploding. If you were going to raise trade barriers against yourself, which is what tariffs are, you would not do it at a time when trade is about to enter its most important period of the year. I mean, again, I keep likening what Trump is doing to Brexit. It's imposing trade barriers on yourself. During Brexit, the Tories never ramped up those trade barriers during this crucial period of trade. They did it in like January, February, when trade is much lower. You know, it would be cataclysmic for jobs. You know, if Trump is going to do this stupid thing, to do it at this time, absolutely cataclysmic for jobs, for inflation, and of course for Treasury tax receipts and bond yields. He ain't going to get his interest rate cuts like this, is he? What Trump is after here is some sort of deal he can sell to his public and that he lets him fool his own ego that he did good. It's the EU's job to make sure Trump can get that without the cost being unacceptable to themselves in order to avoid him triggering the trade war because he feels backed into a corner. You know, Trump needs to be able to make a triumphant reveal of a great trade deal to his public this month. It won't actually get him what he really wants in terms of the EU accepting lower standards. So Trump is going to have to be realistic as well. Otherwise, he is just going to unleash a recession in the US and likely around the world. And as damaging as Trump's own trade policy will be to the United States, as well as himself politically, it's not going to do the EU any good either. They've already had some of their grand plans derailed by the instability Trump has injected into global markets. They're busily working on closer trading terms with other partners in order to offset as much Trump damage as possible. There's the agreement with the UK, now one with Indonesia. Canada's keen to discuss closer trade as well. So failure to agree a deal will hit the EU hard as well. They also need to avoid wrecking the hard work that it took to get Trump to decide he's better off siding with Kyiv than Moscow. That is a huge factor you always have to consider when it comes to this response to a potential trade war. I mean, at least until Trump speaks to Putin next time. Then they have to start again, probably. But from my reading of the situation, see, what we have here is the negotiations between the EU and the US resemble to me a parent with a toddler undergoing a full tantrum in the shops. you need them to calm down ASAP and behave. But appeasing them with the chocolate bar for short-term respite not only costs you, right, but it only feeds their confirmation bias that it's worth demanding more later on. The EU need to convince Trump he's getting the best he can get, that the EU aren't holding out on anything that if pushed they would be willing to concede on. But let me know what you think in the comments below. And for more content, you could subscribe to the channel or even join for access to streams and behind the scenes updates. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.